Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Busher, and I'm the Film Festival Curator for Tadaima 2023 Online Pilgrimage. Welcome to a special session that we are pre-recording about a recent exhibition that I had the privilege to curate in the city of Philadelphia, titled Okaeri, Welcome Home, the Nisei Legacy at Shofuso. The exhibit explores some of the interesting connections and overlaps between the Japanese-American redress movement, the cultural and community organizing that happened in Philadelphia in the post-war era, and the role that traditional Japanese arts and culture played within that entire process. So today I'm going to just share a brief presentation leading to some of our conclusions from this exhibit, introducing some of the main characters from the research that we've done that accompanies it, and sharing out some of our interpretations of the important role that the Nisei played in this community space. And I'm wearing my Shofuso t-shirt in honor of this. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll just get right into the presentation. So I work for the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, and we are a citizen diplomacy organization that practices US-Japan relations on a citizen-to-citizen level, essentially working on a people-to-people grassroots connection from business and culture and education to build and strengthen the relationship between the United States and Japan. And one of the things that sort of sets our organization apart from other Japan America societies is that we do have a large focus within arts and culture. And of course, Japan Society New York also does. But as one of the regional entities, we have the great benefit of operating Shofuso Japanese House and Garden. And this is the space that I'm going to be focusing on in my remarks this afternoon. But just wanted to acknowledge the funders and community partner organizations that are listed here in the logos below. Japanese American Citizens League Philadelphia chapter and the national organization, along with Densho, were immensely helpful in securing funding for us to conduct oral histories with some of the Sansei elders in our local chapter, which then contributed to the narrative materials for the exhibit. The Japanese American Community Foundation is the main funder of this exhibition, and we were very lucky to have a project grant from them that has allowed us to tell this important site-based story. And the Aratani Foundation UCLA Asian American Studies Center grant program has also allowed us to expand the research component. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these entities as we kind of get into the presentation. When you look at this photo, you might assume that we're looking at a Japanese garden in Japan. And many people who do see this photo assume that it is Japan, but as I've mentioned, this is Shofuso, the Japanese house and garden in Philadelphia. It's an incredibly traditional, beautiful space that has meticulously been cared for since 1958 by a variety of stewards from the local Philadelphia community, some of whom were Japanese Americans, some of whom were Shin Issei, Japanese nationals, first-generation immigrants. Others are simply aficionados of Japanese culture who care very deeply for the space and what it has meant for the local communities in West Philadelphia. But looking at this house and garden, it is one of the most traditional Japanese cultural spaces on the East Coast. The style of roof that we see here with the hinoki bark is possibly the only building outside of Japan that has such a roof. Only about 100 craftspeople in the world still practice the style of roofing. So it is a very significant building architecturally, and I would love to kind of share a little bit about the history and how it ended up here in Philadelphia. So this was actually built in 1953, and believe it or not, it was once housed in New York City's Midtown Manhattan at the Museum of Modern Art. These are photos from the installation and exhibition of Shofuso, where it lay in the sculpture garden at MoMA for 2 seasons in 1954 and 1955 as part of their House in the Garden exhibit series. The exhibit series focused on modern architects who came from different regions of the world. And Arthur Drexler, who was the curator of architecture and design at the time, had this idea to, instead of inviting a Japanese modern architect to do a modern space, perhaps they could look at the similarities and parallels between Japanese traditional architecture and modern architecture that was happening in early and mid-century 20th century. And so he did just that. He invited Junzo Yoshimura, who was one of the leading modern architects who was working in Japan during the post-war era, to come to New York and meet with him and discuss what might be possible. And so the two of them settled on a traditional 17th century style temple guest house. It's loosely modeled after the guest house at Kojoin, which is a temple complex near Biwako, east of Kyoto. And ultimately, looking at making it as realistic as possible to that style of architecture, utilizing the same methods that were used at that time period. And within Japanese traditional architecture, very few nails are used. Most of it is post and beam and interlocking wood, cut to size. And this is important, I think, in terms of the landscape and the geology of Japan, being a nation that is prone to earthquakes and other natural disasters. When you have wood that has been fashioned into place by nails or screws, it tends to break and snap under duress, whereas the post and beam interlocking wood system will bend and sway. And so this is this sort of ancestral wisdom that the Japanese architects were building with. In any case, this was a tremendous undertaking. In 1953, some 8 years after the end of World War II, post-war Japan was still in shambles, still struggling to rebuild its infrastructure. And it was a pretty momentous opportunity to kind of build some friendly connections between the United States and Japan. And so the government of Japan got behind this project and basically decided that this would be a gift from the people of Japan to the people of the United States. And so they worked with Junzo Yoshimura and a team of craftsmen who specialized in these traditional styles of architecture in the city of Nagoya, and they built it. And they built it completely as a standing structure, and then took it apart piece by piece, shipping it in over 6,000 separate crates to New York City, where it was then reconstructed in the sculpture garden here at MoMA, where we see this photo being taken during the reinstallation. And so it was an incredible project. It was also an incredible risk that was being taken by both Japan and the United States, given the fever pitch of anti-Japanese sentiment that certainly the Japanese American community is aware of. A lot of folks were not happy about the US and Japan mending its ties as closely as we had in an era when China had now become a communist threat, when Japan was a strategically important ally to combat the spread of communism, when during the Korean War, the bulk of US military production for the conflict was happening in Japan. And ultimately, a lot of American soldiers were spending a great deal of time in Japan. In some ways, this actually does help to change the hearts and minds of the American people. But for the every person who lived in New York City, for example, and other major cities on the East Coast, and certainly on the West Coast, I think the anti-Japanese propaganda had remained so strong in the public imagination that it would take some time for the wounds of World War II to mend. This project was actually a tremendous part of that. And in the 2 years that it was on display in 1954 and 1955, the House in the Garden exhibit attracts over 200,000 visitors. It was the most popular exhibit that MoMA had hosted possibly to date at that point in the museum's history. and is remembered as one of the first successful attempts at soft power diplomacy using culture to sort of mend the ties between the United States and Japan. So this is a tremendously important and also successful exhibit in New York City. But of course, New York and MoMA being what they were, this could not remain as a permanent installation. They needed to clear space for future exhibits. And they made the decision to deinstall the house after the 1955 season, where it sat then in storage for a couple of years in New York before it was ultimately brought to Philadelphia. So that might seem like an odd choice, but ultimately, Philadelphia is one of the sites that has the longest continuous Japanese cultural presence in the United States. And not many people realize this, but when you think about the era that Japan was forcibly opened to trade with the United States in the 1860s and into the 1870s and 80s, even, Philadelphia was an incredibly important city in the United States, economically, politically, culturally, being our nation's first capital, being the place where so much of the commerce and industry and manufacturing, industrial technology was being developed and implemented. And in 1876, Philadelphia was the host of the Centennial Exposition, which was sort of a precursor to the World's Fairs that allowed the city of Philadelphia to really shine as this center of science and industry and culture and commerce and exchange. And countries from around the world were invited to participate. Japan, of course, being a fairly new player in the global politics, saw this as a tremendous opportunity to showcase their own culture and sort of frame their own culture in the eyes of the West and the eyes of the world. They wanted to show off a little bit. They wanted to show people, this is what we're capable of, and these are our traditional techniques that differ from the West, and yet allow us to produce these things that are beautiful and that are significant culturally and economically. So the Japanese Pavilion and the Japanese Bazaar were two of the most successful exhibits at the Centennial Exposition. Ultimately, in the years that followed, many of these buildings were destroyed or removed intentionally. Currently, in 2023, only about 5 of the original structures from the Centennial Exposition remained, including a couple of storage pavilions that Japan America Society still uses, actually. But the reason that this site was chosen is because the current home for Shofuso in West Fairmount Park is only about 100 yards away from the original location of the Japanese Bazaar, which is pictured here in the top right of the slide. The bottom right is Shofuso being reconstructed in 1957 in the park. So this was made a lot of sense from a historical standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. At the time, John D. Rockefeller III was actually the president of the board of Japan Society New York, and their family foundation paid for Shofuso to be rehomed permanently in Philadelphia. So by 1958, the site reopened to the public, and it was quite successful. There was a lot of contemporary press coverage that was quite positive. But as you might imagine, there was also some very negative responses from community members who had either fought in the Pacific Front of World War II or had family members who fought in and or died in that front of the war. And they didn't feel that it was appropriate for the city of Philadelphia to be investing in this Japanese structure. And the sort of friendly diplomacy component that was so successful in the New York context was not really understood or interpreted in such a way by the local Philadelphia public at that time period. Sadly, between the lackluster response from some of the Philadelphians, as well as the city of Philadelphia's failure to have cultural competency around the space, and also just lack of investment in maintenance and upkeep of the house, led to essentially neglect, and the house fell into a state of disrepair. And unfortunately, then by the mid 1970s, as the city began to lose its industrial manufacturing base and the factories start closing, there are a lot of social issues that are developing in the city. There's a lot of joblessness, there's homelessness. We start to see a rise in violent crime and vandalism and petty theft. And Shofuso became a target. In those days, there was no fence that surrounded it, and people could sort of easily walk into the space. And being a traditional Japanese structure, there was very little that people could do to keep the site from degrading and being vandalized. And the worst of it, on the interior Fusuma sliding door panels, were a series of incredible murals painted by Kai Higashiyama, who was a living treasure of Japan, one of the artists who was affiliated with the Kano school in the late mid to late 20th century. And unfortunately, his works were destroyed beyond repair. People took box cutters and knives to them and slashed them, or did graffiti painting over the portraits. So there was nothing left to save. It was so bad, in fact, that the government of Japan actually threatened to take the house back at one point. So ultimately, in the lead up to the bicentennial celebration in 1976, which also was a big deal for Philadelphia, given its history in the original Declaration of Independence and so on, the city decided to work with a group of Japanese corporations and the Japanese government to essentially fund and restore the house to what it was similar to the original condition in 1954 when it was first displayed in New York City's MoMA. So this was all well and good, but ultimately the city of Philadelphia still had no real plans going forward for how they were going to take care of this space. And of course, the people who were clued into what was happening there were deeply concerned about what might happen next, given the sort of track record of vandalism and degradation of the site. And ultimately, this is when the conversation begins about the Nisei generation in Philadelphia. And so, with a little bit of context here, Japanese Americans really were few, if any, in the greater Philadelphia area before World War II. In the 1940 census, it shows less than 50 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the city of Philadelphia. By 1947, about 7,000 people were living here. And so it was almost exclusively because of the wartime removal, forced evictions on the West Coast, the incarceration and subsequent resettlement into cities on the East Coast and the Midwest that led to Philadelphia being a place where there were a sizable population of Japanese Americans. Part of this has to do with the advocacy that the Quakers showed to Japanese Americans, being the only group that was really vocal in opposition to the wartime incarceration as it was happening. The Quakers and their advocacy organization, the American Friends Service Committee, basically came together and said, this is wrong. We don't have the political capital to stop it from happening, but we will try to do everything in our power to make the conditions better within the camps. And so that's why when you start to research some of the people that were involved in the WRA administration, or even as educators or social workers in the camp, you'll start to see a lot of Quaker names involved in that space. And ultimately, they were able to petition the government to create the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council, which was a national organization based in the city of Philadelphia. And it allowed for college-aged Nisei to come out and resettle as early as the fall of 1942. And the first universities that allowed people to come into them after the camp were Quaker institutions like Swarthmore College and Bryn Mawr, and later the Friends schools, which are K through 12 and high school. So starting with the students and then later bringing out the parents of the students who had been resettled into the region, we start to see a large and growing community of Nisei and also Issei who are living here in Philadelphia. Certainly by 1943 and 44, as the resettlement begins in earnest, this becomes one of the more highly sought after locations that people are beginning to resettle in. And for the most part, it was fairly well received by the general public here in Philadelphia, despite some of the earlier comments that I mentioned about the reluctance to accept a Japanese house within West Philadelphia. So there was a sizable portion of Nisei that were living here by the end of World War II and into the 40s and 50s and beyond. About half of that 7,000 does eventually return to the West Coast after the military exclusion zone is lifted. But the folks who remain have the challenging prospect of creating a Japanese American community more or less from the ground up. So there were certain resources available to them. Certainly in the resettlement era, there was a lot of support from the Quakers. There were some support measures put into place by the Regional War Relocation Authority Resettlement Office that was also based in Philadelphia. But ultimately, I think it really started to sort of consolidate with the formation of the JACL Philadelphia chapter in 1947. And so in that year and going forward, the Nisei found a space to organize themselves. And I think like most JACL chapters, it's a little bit of socialization, a little bit of advocacy and civil rights. And certainly at different time periods, it ebbs and flows based on what's happening in the national politics of that era. But for the most part, Philadelphia's JACL community was really on the forefront of a lot of the civil rights issues and was participating in things, for example, as early as the fight for the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952 that allowed the Asian immigrants and the Issei to become naturalized American citizens. This is something that the local chapter was very vocal about. And we had members of the chapter who became involved in the 1960s when the March on Washington or the Selma Montgomery marches were taking place. One of our chapter members later became a judge. William Madartani was actually a pro bono civil rights attorney who spent time working in the Deep South, helping folks who were locked up in trumped up charges for voting rights issues in Mississippi and Alabama. Another chapter member spent time working for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and doing hate crime reporting in the Jim Crow South. So there's this sort of interesting history, and I think also acknowledging that Philadelphia, even back then, was a majority African-American city and continues to be to this day. So the context of being Japanese American in Philadelphia is a little bit different than being Japanese American in just about any other big city where people came to and in the aftermath of World War II. And so, you know, the way that the community reconstituted itself and the sort of understanding of racialized identity and obviously being neither white nor black and trying to find some place within these racialized politics of that era when it was really just a sort of dual conversation, or the duality of a black-white binary without much room for conversations of people whose identities didn't fit into either of those categories neatly. Presented unique challenges and also presented unique opportunities as Japanese Americans in Philadelphia began to engage in sort of the broader civil rights movement, began, as many other Japanese Americans and certainly JACL chapters were nationwide, in racial solidarity and coalition building. And this is really present, I think, in a lot of ways in the lead up to the bicentennial. We had seen a lot of cross-racial solidarity organizing taking place in Philadelphia. Japanese Americans were part of that conversation. And ultimately, when the conversation around Shofuso becomes public, and we see the extent to which the Japanese government has invested in Shofuso, and I think even the public threat of taking the house back was known to the the folks in the community who were kind of in the know, there was a sense of collective responsibility that the Nisei had to step up and figure this out themselves, because unfortunately, the city of Philadelphia lacked the resources and the political will to take ownership of the house and garden and preserve it and maintain it in the ways that they needed to. So it's a long way of saying that the Nisei kind of stepped in to save the day. And from 1981, when the Nisei begin organizing a informal friends group, and in 1982, when they establish it as a 501c3 nonprofit, the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden becomes this entity that is not just doing maintenance and restoration work, but also begins creating sort of daily programs that really activated the space. Before, this was just sort of a passive garden viewing experience. When the Nisei became involved, they started doing things like tea ceremony. They started doing things like cultural festivals, obon, tanabata, oshogatsu, akimatsuri, and really, using this as an opportunity to celebrate the culture of their immigrant parents, and perhaps to teach their sansei children a little bit about the Japanese identity that for at least the last few decades had really been stigmatized in the post-war era. So more on that later. But looking at this date range, I think it's also important to take stock of the fact that this is when the national redress movement is happening. And actually, a number of the same Nisei who were involved in the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden were also leaders within the national redress movement. And so this is kind of where we start to get into an interesting conversation about where and how this group of people came into the picture, maybe what is their intention behind organizing as such, and is there more to this story that hasn't been told, that we should be giving credit where it hasn't been given previously to the Nisei generation, and sort of the role and the strategy that was involved in Japanese arts and cultural practice in this era. So very briefly, the way that this exhibit sort of came about, I started working for Japan America Society in August of 2021. And about a week into my job, I was going through the archives and discovered a typewritten board roster from 1983. And I recognized the name of one of my fellow JACL Philadelphia board members, Teresa Maibori, a sansei who's been active with JACL since the 1980s here in Philadelphia. And it just really surprised me, because it never occurred to me in the 15 years or so that I've lived in Philadelphia. I've known Shofuso as a Japanese expat space, because it's mostly Shin Issei and recent immigrants who are living there in the region, who are involved in some of the cultural activities, and non-Japanese people who have some sort of affinity for Japanese culture. I didn't really know this as a Japanese American community space, but the more that I began to do some research and talking to some of the elders within our JACL chapter, I realized that in fact this was the center of the Japanese American community in Philadelphia, at least during this time period of the mid to late 1980s and into the 1990s. So over time, as I began to do some research into the archives at Japan America Society, which included the archives from Friends of the Japanese House and Garden since the merger in 2016, I realized that this was a bigger undertaking than I was able to do myself. And we were able to then apply for and receive a grant funding from the Japanese American Community Foundation, who have graciously supported this effort and allowed us to bring on my research assistant, Lauren Griffin, as a key member of this exhibit team. Lauren was completing a master's in public history at Temple University and working as a docent at Shofuso when I met her. And she also had some experience in audio journalism. So for the purpose of this project, perfect fit, and just very lucky to have her already sort of within the fold of Japan-America Society. But together, and mostly with Lauren leading the research phase, we were able to go through the archive at our office and piece together sort of the historical record and the roles that the different Nisei leaders each held within Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, and kind of put together a loose timeline. And then, Lauren also did some research at the Fairmount Park Commission archives and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to help connect the dots a little bit with regards to the city and some of the issues that were happening behind the scenes there. And one example that I'll share briefly, with the lack of cultural competency that the city had, at one point, a Fairmount Park commissioner in the 1960s was suggesting that a Japanese family could live in Shofuso rent-free as the caretakers. And never mind that it was a place without running water, indoor plumbing, or electricity. But that was where the city was in 1960s, right? And so what a difference it was when the Nisei came in. And over the past couple of years, we've been able to piece together this information that eventually became the narrative for the exhibition. So I'd like to talk a little bit about each of the key figures, and then I can talk a little bit more about how the exhibit has manifested physically in the space. So Dr. Mary Ishimoto Watanabe, she is such a significant figure who has really not been studied as much as she should be. She did incredible work really throughout her life as a researcher, as a chemist, and later as a Japanese language teacher. She was one of the founding faculty members in the Center of East Asian Studies Japanese language program. She later went on to be the executive director at the Asian Pacific Coalition, an early Pan-Asian American civil rights organization. And ultimately, when all of these issues came to light about what was happening at Shofuso, she was the person who organized the fellow Nisei to come together and create the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden. And so for about 8 years, she was the board president. And although there was no paid position of executive director in those days, essentially this is Mary's role. And so, she did so much to bring this group together, and so much to preserve the house. And it was really, truly her vision that allowed this to come into fruition. And her husband, Warren Watanabe, was also very involved throughout this time period. Reiko Nakawatase Gaspar is another person who was very significant in the development of the programming at Shofuso. So Reiko was an elementary school teacher who lived and worked in West Philadelphia, not far from where Shofuso was located. She had an understanding of the local communities and sort of how to energize them around these topics. She, after spending about 2 decades as a public school teacher, she then spent the last decade of her career working at the Civic Center Museum, which was sort of a special events field trip center in the school district. And she would do cultural workshops and teach specialist curriculum around Japan and Japanese American topics. So she was perfectly suited to basically create a educational program at Shofuso, and did in fact develop the first public tours to give to school groups that were visiting K through 12, but then also developed these tours for adults and trained the docents and other members of the Friends to be able to give these tours as well. And the tours that we give to this day are still based on the foundation that she created for us. At the same time that she was doing this work, she served as the JACL Philadelphia chapter president. She was deeply involved in the national redress movement. She had co-curated an exhibition along with Mary Watanabe in 1985 titled The Japanese American Experience, which was at the Balch Institute for Ethnic Studies. And it was the first public exhibition in the city of Philadelphia about the Japanese American wartime incarceration. So at the height of redress, when people were really actively lobbying and trying to build empathy and support among the general public, the JACL, the Friends, and people like Reiko and Mary were really forward thinking in connecting the dots and bringing together these different spaces to sort of push the pressure points where they could and gain support among different groups of people in different ways, understanding perhaps that some people would be more inclined to support with a very historical exhibition like the one that they organized at the Balsh Institute, whereas other people might need to have the culture of Japan demystified for them before they could really understand the difference and the nuance between Japanese Americans and Japanese in Japan, and therefore understand the role and responsibility and really the wrongs that had been committed by the United States government in illegally evacuating and removing forcibly the Japanese American community and incarcerating them. The last thing I'll mention before changing slides here is that this little girl on the bridge here is Reiko, as a child at the post in Camp 1, standing in front of the school barracks with her class. And I just thought it was really ironic that she would spend her later years volunteering at a similar Japanese cultural space in Philadelphia. Louise Sasai Maihara was another really key member of the Friends group. She was a social worker who came to Philadelphia during World War II. She was from Hawaii, so her and her family were not incarcerated, but they were in the mainland of the United States because her husband Saburo was a member of the 100th Infantry Battalion. And so while he was doing basic training at Camp Shelby, her and her daughter Mickey were living in New York City, since it was easier for them to commute and for him to visit them on leave. Ultimately, after he was killed in action during his service, there was not much that they could do to get back to Hawaii. At the time, it was, although not under the same conditions of the West Coast military exclusion zone, the freedom of movement was highly governed, and being of Japanese ancestry, the War Department did not want to let them back into Hawaii. So having gone to school at University of Pennsylvania for social work earlier in her life, Louise decided to move to Philadelphia, and she raised Mickey as a single mom in Philadelphia. And so much later down the timeline, she becomes deeply involved with Shofuso and is sort of remembered as the heart and the soul of this organization. People know her as the house mom, and she was just this sort of effervescent, positive presence that really made people feel like it was a community space. And if you didn't know what you were doing, then she would tell you what you needed to do to take care of the house, but in a way that was endearing. And again, it made it feel like a family environment, as so many of these Japanese American community spaces do feel. Louise was incredibly long-lived and actually just passed away last decade, close to the age of 100, I believe, maybe at 100. So she continued her engagement in the space. Her daughter, Mickey Rotman, became involved with the space. And even her grandson, Lucas Rotman, became involved as a docent, working here in one of his first jobs. So a long history here, and glad to be able to tell these stories. So Grace Kaneda Uehara, Grace Uehara, as most people know her, is, of course, for folks who are familiar with the history of redress, a familiar name. She served as the executive director of JACL's Legislative Education Committee during the final years of redress, when it was about basically convincing the Senate to vote yes, and working whatever angle that they could as a national organization, and of course working in concert with many, many other Japanese American entities throughout the country to do so. But Grace had a really important leadership role in this as the executive director. And it happened that, her and her husband Hiroshi had been involved with JACL since the very beginning. When the chapter was founded in 1947, they were actually co-founders of the Philadelphia Nisei Council, which was an organization created during the resettlement to basically help fellow Nisei and their Issei parents to resettle after the wartime incarceration. And so they had been deeply involved in these kinds of community organizing spaces and had both held leadership roles in the local chapter for many decades. They also were very involved in cultural activities. For a couple of decades in the 1960s and into the 70s, there used to be a Philadelphia folk festival where different ethnic communities would come together and share aspects of their traditional culture, folk dancing, music, food culture. And so JACL always participated, and they were truly the ones that carried that. And so while they were not formally involved as board members until 1988, when Hiroshi joined the board of Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, they had been longtime supporters, donors, and participants in many of the cultural programs that took place here. And I'll just mention that their son, Paul Uehara, who's pictured here in this tuxedo in the bottom right-hand corner, was even married here at Shofuso. It was the first time that a public wedding ceremony was allowed to be held at the house and garden. And so it also speaks, I think, to the significance of this space within the Japanese American community, that this could be a place where celebrations like a wedding could take place. And should mention also that Louise Maihara's memorial service was also held at Shofuso. So it has continued to be a deeply important space for the community in remembrance and bringing together people. And the last person that I want to talk about briefly is Judge William Madutani, and I mentioned him earlier briefly, but he was the first Asian American judge in the state of Pennsylvania, and he did very important groundbreaking work here in the state of Pennsylvania, in the city of Philadelphia, as a judge on the Court of Common Pleas. One of his landmark rulings was to end the gender segregation of Philadelphia Central High School, which, you know, the best public high school in Philadelphia, which had been excluded to only boys up to a certain year when he made the ruling to desegregate it. But, you know, his commitment to civil rights is deep. He gave a friendly amicus brief to the U.S. Supreme Court during the Loving versus Virginia court case that ended anti-miscegenation laws. Had spent time in the Deep South, as I mentioned earlier, doing pro bono civil rights attorney work. And he was actually the only person of Japanese ancestry who served on the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. So he was in every single hearing. We see him pictured in one in the top right-hand corner, and listened to his fellow countrymen and Nisei and Issei talk about the experiences and the hardships and the trauma of the forced removal and incarceration, and ultimately co-authored the commission's final report, Personal Justice Denied, which was the first government report to suggest a formal apology was necessary, and also suggested that a one-time payment of $20,000 should be paid to each incarceration survivor. So he did great and important work in many different spaces. With regards to the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, Judge Marutani was a donor and certainly contributed to many of their fundraising campaigns, and was a regular participant at many of their cultural programs. But in 1987, as we were going through some of the records in the archive, we found some interesting notes and also a flyer advertising a lecture that he gave, what was being called the Winter Lecture Series, on the role of Japanese Americans in civil rights advocacy. And this was an official program of the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, less than a year before the redress bill is finally signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, with all of the most important leaders of the national redress movement who were based in Philadelphia present and or part of this organizing committee who had put together this event, that were also organizing regular cultural programs at Shofuso. All of it sort of stacks up to basically the following, which is, you know, we have had to do a tremendous amount of interpretation here, because as anyone who's from the community knows, the Nisei were humble to a fault, really, and really did not take credit for the incredible accomplishments and community labor that they did throughout their lives. And so without them keeping record they took tremendous records of many other things, but they did not record their own contributions, and they did not record their own stories or their roles in doing this work, nor even the intentions for doing this work in the context of Shofuso. So for us, myself as a yonsei, and for others who are working sort of adjacently in this space, either as allies to the Japanese American community or other like Shin Nikkei community folks that are part of this exhibit, we had to really interpret what their legacy was. And so we've come to the following two conclusions. Basically, Shofuso was a physical community space for the Japanese American community to come together in the post-war era. Philadelphia doesn't have a large Japanese American presence. We don't have even a Japanese Buddhist temple here. There were very few Japanese restaurants until the last decade or two. And so when we look at how communities form and engage and kind of retain that community feel, you need that physical presence. And Shofuso became that space for our community to come together and in general have these kinds of meaningful relationships and interactions, but also to engage in cultural reclamation. And I think this is one of the most important pieces, because when you think about the push to assimilate in the post-war era and the sort of willful sort of stigmatization of Japanese culture, how few Nisei elected to teach their sansei children the Japanese language, and the very real threat and danger that people faced by doing so, or by showing themselves to be Japanese outwardly at this time period in close proximity to World War II. These were deeply, deeply stigmatized identities and cultural markers that most people shunned, and for good reason, because they had to in order to survive. And yet, at this time period, the Nisei came together and they realized, and they were quite, I think, vocal about this part at least, that Shofuso gave them an opportunity to re-embrace the culture of their Japanese immigrant parents, and also to teach their sansei children about the country and culture that they came from. So this is a deeply, deeply important piece. And I think, honestly, it allowed some of them in their later years to shed some of that stigma and possibly even heal from some of the trauma that they felt from the wartime incarceration and the stigmatization of Japanese identity. And so the second very important piece that I would like to state here is that the same Nisei leaders, as we discussed, were all involved in the redress movement. They were all involved in other types of community organizing. They were all civil rights activists and leaders in these spaces. And I think it's safe to say that they saw educating the public about Japanese culture as a step forward to build solidarity and empathy between the Japanese American community and the general public in Philadelphia. And we do actually have some writing to suggest this in the early mission statements that were drafted by Mary Watanabe and some of these other leaders of the Friends group. So I just want to talk briefly then about the exhibit itself and share some ways that people can engage in this content if you'd like to. This is the main installation at Shofuso. It's the interior of the house in what we call the 10 mat room, because there's 10 tatami mats. And we have a 3-channel projection installation that shows in the center channel a slideshow of the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, basically in that entire 20-year time period that they were most active, from 1981 until 1999. And just in daily interactions at the house and the sort of community labor that went into it. But we also, in this slideshow, have interspersed photographs of them in camp. Many of the folks who resettled here early were featured also in some of the WRA photography section propaganda photos showing the resettlement and sort of euphemizing what it meant to be displaced and then resettled into this third location. So, it's really a holistic way of understanding that these people carried this experience with them throughout their entire lives, and to think that it wouldn't impact their decisions or their intentions behind something like organizing in a cultural community space, it I think gives us a little bit more understanding of what that means. So that's the center channel. The left channel is found footage that was actually shipped to us by the estate of Isao Okumura, who was the head carpenter that worked on Shofuso along with architect Junzo Yoshimura. And so in 1957, he came to Philadelphia and using a home movie camera, recorded the reconstruction and installation of Shofuso right here in West Fairmount Park. And so the reel starts with some of the footage from the New York MoMA exhibit, and then it shows them building the house again here in Philadelphia. And then opposite of that is in 1999, the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden had mounted a massive capital campaign to raise about $1.5 million, which was the sum required to restore the roof using traditional methods with the hinoki cypress bark and utilizing some of the World Heritage crafts experts who came from Japan and worked in these traditional methods to restore the house. So tremendously costly endeavor, and nearly half of that was raised through individual contributions donated by the Nisei. So this was truly their last hurrah in a lot of ways with Shofuso. By the end of the 90s, they sort of had aged out of active engagement with the organization, although many of them would live for another decade or so. This was sort of the end of their active lives in community organizing and labor, at least as regards to the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden. And it felt like an appropriate way to sort of bookend this exhibit. The table that sits in front of the three projectors has reading materials related to the resettlement. We actually reprinted and reproduced some of the pamphlets that were given to the Japanese American incarceration folk in the camps, like inviting them to come and resettle in Philadelphia. These are things that were either produced by the War Relocation Authority or by the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council. And it gives some context to how and why some of these individuals came here to Philadelphia. And I'll also note that a couple of the publications feature photographs of the same Nisei leaders as they were resettled. And a couple even have articles and quotes from folks like Hiroshi Uehara and Grace Kaneda, later Uehara, in their Nisei council roles, inviting other folks to come and resettle in Philadelphia. So this is the main part of the exhibit. And we've been intentional to allow the house and garden to sort of function in the way that it's meant to. It's almost an opt-in experience. We don't want to ruin the majestic beauty of the garden. And so it allows people to engage with the content in such a way that doesn't disrupt the natural beauty of the site. So that's been very important in terms of how we thought about this. The last very important part that I should mention about this room is that we had conducted a series of oral histories through funds that were made available by the Japanese American Citizens League and Densho to do about a dozen new oral histories with Sansei elders from the Philadelphia and Seabrook JACL chapters, many of whom either were children or siblings of some of these Nisei leaders that we've been talking about, others who had some sort of connection here to the space. And we've taken quotes from those and also integrated them with a series of oral histories taken in 1994 by the JACL Philadelphia chapter that actually features interviews with most of these Nisei leaders. And so we have about 30 minutes of quotes that are sort of on a looping reel that talk about everything from resettling to Philadelphia to their wartime experience to the role that Japanese arts and culture have played in their identity formation, to the actual role of working with and labor involved with being part of the Friends group, and the meaning that Shofuso held for them. So it's a deeply meaningful way to sort of engage with the actual voices and perspectives of the Nisei leaders themselves and bringing them back into this space. The title of the exhibit, Okaeri, Welcome Home, invites them and their presence and their stories back into this narrative of Shofuso. We also created a timeline that sort of shows the global interactions between US and Japan, but then also very specific history related to the wartime incarceration and post-war resettlement, and then ultimately the timeline for when the Nisei leaders were most involved here at Shofuso. So this is in another room that's along the veranda of Shofuso that people can spend time with. It's also available on the exhibit website. And the last room of the exhibit is in the format room. We have these two display cases with artifacts that basically demonstrate, I think, some of the interconnectedness of the Japanese American community between the JACL, between the Friends group, and between other community and cultural entities that existed in the region, including the Seabrook Buddhist Temple and the community that was left there after Seabrook Farms had invited 2,500 Japanese Americans to live in the area and work on the farm. But then also artifacts from, say, the redress period. Some of the pamphlets that were personally owned by people like Reiko Gaspar or Judge Marutani, things that some of them wrote, like the Personal Justice Denied, to demonstrate the sort of interrelated nature of the work that they were doing, and do this in a way that sort of connects the physical artifacts to the stories that we're telling in this more sort of ephemeral audio and video photo projection in the other 10 mat room. So the last part of the exhibit that I'll mention is the website. And I hope that all of you watching this will have an opportunity to come and visit us in person. The exhibit is up at Shofuso through December 10th, 2023. We're also talking about remounting the exhibit in the week of July 10th to the 14th, 2024, during the JACL National Convention that will be hosted in Philadelphia. But in case you're unable to visit us in person, I hope you'll do the next best thing, which is to visit our exhibit website, which holds the main narrative from the exhibit, which has a number of the photographs that are referenced in some of these materials, and a couple video resources, including the two projections that I had mentioned just briefly. We're in the process of building out the website further. In the months to come, we are planning to add like a formal document viewer section so people can see some of the primary source documents that the research and curatorial team has made our interpretations from. And the last thing that we're doing on both the site and online, we're creating a self-guided audio tour consisting of short format, almost podcast episodes, but anywhere from 3 to 6 minutes long, 5 of them in total, exploring the role and contributions of each of the main characters that I've introduced from the exhibition. And again, using their own voices to tell parts of the story, pulling from these oral histories that we had of them in the 1990s, and some of the commentary from their siblings or children that were just taken over the summer of 2023. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to a little bit about the story of the Nisei and their legacy at Shofuso. I think if there's a lesson here, it's that we all have to really take advantage of the time that we have and to tell our own stories. You know, we think that we've interpreted this as best as we can, but what a gift it would be if we had been able to talk to the Nisei about this directly. But again, thank you for listening to this program. I hope that you will engage in the exhibit website in some capacity, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Tadaima 2023 experience. Thanks.